My name is Laurel Voss, and I am 27 years old. 3 months ago, my mother called me on a Tuesday afternoon and invited me to a family dinner to celebrate my cousin Marcus getting into law school. She said it warmly. She said it the way she says things when the warmth is load-bearing. I said yes. I drove 40 minutes. I walked into the private room at the back of Carmine's Italian kitchen, the one they rent for rehearsal dinners and retirement parties, and I found 11 members of my family already seated around a table with a banner on the wall that said "Congratulations, Marcus" in gold letters, and a chair at the far end that had been left empty in the specific way chairs are left empty when everyone knows whose it is and nobody wants to be seen saving it. Marcus was at the head of the table. He was 22. He had gotten into one law school. It was his third application cycle. I sat down in my designated chair and watched my aunt pour champagne for the table and thought about the year I got into my graduate program on the first try, on a full fellowship. And my family sent a group text with 3 emojis and moved on. I thought about that for approximately 45 seconds. Then I thought about what I had heard at my grandfather's funeral reception 11 months before through the thin door of the study off the hallway. 2 voices I recognized and 1 sentence I have not stopped thinking about since. I thought about the folder I had brought, and I waited. Before I tell you what was in that folder, and what was said at that dinner, and what my mother's face did when she finally understood what my grandfather had done before he died, I need to take you back to where this story actually starts, because it does not start with Marcus and his law school acceptance. It starts 31 years ago in a small house in Davenport, Iowa, with a man named Gerald Voss who drove a city bus for 22 years and believed, with the specific conviction of someone who had never been given much, that education was the one thing nobody could repossess. If you're new here, welcome to Stillwater's Drama. Please subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. I read every single one. Now, let me take you back to Davenport. Gerald Voss, my grandfather, was 63 when I was born and had already lived 3 lives by then. He grew up in rural Mississippi, the 4th of 7 children, in a house where finishing high school was considered ambitious, and college was a word that belonged to other people's children. He moved north at 19 with $40 and a suitcase his mother had packed for him. He drove a city bus. He married my grandmother, Ida, who worked 30 years as a school cafeteria manager and kept a garden that fed half the block in summer. They had 2 children. My father, Randall, who became a high school football coach and is the quieter, more careful of the 2. And my Aunt Vera, who became a real estate agent, married well on the second try, and has strong opinions about most things, including me. Grandpa Gerald never went to college. This was the fact of his life he returned to most often. Not with bitterness exactly, but with the particular attention a person gives to a door they never got to open. He talked about it the way you talk about a country you always meant to visit. Present tense, still possible in the imagination, foreclosed only by the specific accumulation of circumstance. What he did instead was watch. He watched which children in his family went to college and which ones didn't, and he watched what happened to each of them afterward. And he drew his own conclusions with the patience of a man who had driven a bus long enough to understand that where you end up depends almost entirely on which stops you were allowed to board at. I was the one he watched closest. I don't know exactly why. I was not the prettiest or the loudest or the one most likely to get called on in a room. I was the one who asked questions. I was the one who at age 7 wanted to know why the Hendersons across the street had to move and what happened to the house after they left and who decided. Grandpa Gerald was the only adult in my life who answered questions like that directly, instead of saying something vague and moving on. He said, "The bank decided, baby." And the reason the bank got to decide is because they had paper. The Hendersons didn't. I said, "What kind of paper?" He said, "The kind that says who owns what and who gets to keep it." I filed that away at 7 years old. I did not know I was filing it, but it went in. My family's dynamic, the shape of it, is something I understood slowly and then all at once. The way you understand a magic trick after someone shows you the mechanism. My cousin Marcus is Aunt Vera's son. He is 4 years younger than me, blonde where I am dark, loud where I am quiet, the kind of person who fills a room by volume rather than by weight. He is not a bad person. I want to be clear about that because this story can sound like it is about Marcus, and it is not. Marcus is not the villain. Marcus is the weather, the thing that happens to you while other things are being decided by other people. Vera has always preferred Marcus. This is not a secret. She has never pretended otherwise. She once said, at a Thanksgiving table I was sitting at, that Marcus was simply more naturally gifted, and that some children required more investment than others. I was 17. The naturally gifted child she was referring to was 13 and had just been caught cheating on a geography test. My father heard her say it. He looked at his plate. My father has always been the kind of man who believes that letting things go is the same as being peaceful. He has confused silence for grace his entire life. I love him. He's cost me things. My mother, Sandra, is a subtler instrument than Vera. She does not say out loud that Marcus matters more. She simply responds to Marcus-related news at a different volume than she responds to mine. When Marcus made the junior varsity basketball team, she bought a cake. When I was accepted to the University of Iowa on academic merit, she said, "That's great, honey," and asked if I wanted pasta for dinner. I'm not saying this to indict her. I'm saying it because you need to understand the water I swam in, so that you understand why. When Grandpa Gerald paid attention to me, it felt like coming up for air. He came to my high school graduation. He sat in the third row in a suit he had dry cleaned for the occasion, and when I walked across the stage, he stood up. The only person in my family who stood, I could see him from the stage. This old man in a good suit on his feet, and I had to look at the ceiling for a moment to get myself together. After the ceremony, he found me in the crowd. He held both my hands and looked at me for a long moment without saying anything performative or proud. Then he said, "You're just getting started, Laurel. Don't let anybody convince you you've already arrived." I said, "I won't, Grandpa," he said. "I know you won't. That's why I'm not worried." I thought he meant it as a grandfather's encouragement. He meant something more specific. I would not find out how specific until the afternoon of his funeral reception, 3 years after he was gone. I went into social work because of Mrs. Patrice Odoms, my 8th grade school counselor, who was the first adult outside my family who saw me clearly and said so out loud. She was the one who pulled me aside after I'd written an essay about the Henderson family and told me I had a gift for understanding systems. Not just people systems, the way things connected. The way outcomes that looked individual were almost always structural. I went to the University of Iowa. I studied social work. I got my MSW on a fellowship that covered full tuition and a stipend, and I worked 20 hours a week in a family services agency the entire time, so I would graduate with experience, not just a degree. I'm 27 now. I'm a case manager at a family services nonprofit in Cedar Rapids. I work with families navigating child welfare systems, housing instability, benefit access. I spend my days helping people understand what they are entitled to, what the system owes them, and how to document everything so that when someone tries to tell them they don't qualify or they misunderstood or they sign something that means they get nothing, they have the paper that says otherwise. I understand paper. Grandpa Gerald was right about paper. I understand family systems too, which is my profession, but I understood them before it was my profession because I grew up inside one that required careful study to survive. I know what it looks like when resources flow toward one child and away from another. I know how it's justified. I know the language families use to make imbalance sound like fairness. More naturally gifted, more motivated. He just needs a little more support right now. I know all of it. Grandpa Gerald died in October 2 years ago. He was 81. He went the way he always said he wanted to, which was in his own home, in his own bed, without a great deal of drama. He had been slowing down for 2 years and everyone could see it but him, or at least he declined to acknowledge it, which amounted to the same thing. The funeral was on a Thursday. Gray October sky, the kind of cold that is more damp than cold. The church was full. Gerald Voss had driven a city bus for 22 years, and he knew half of Davenport, and half of Davenport came to say goodbye. I spoke. Not because I was asked. Because I asked to. which is a distinction I think about. No one in my family offered me the microphone. I requested it through my father, who relayed it to Vera, who agreed with the specific graciousness of someone who thinks it doesn't matter. I spoke for 4 minutes. I talked about the Henderson family and what Grandpa Gerald told me about paper. I talked about him standing up at my graduation. I talked about the man who drove a city bus and believed in education with the fervor of someone who understood from the inside what it cost to be denied it. The reception was at my grandparents' house afterward. Ida, my grandmother, was still living there. She moved through the rooms with the particular efficiency of a woman who has spent 50 years hosting and was not going to stop now. Grief or no grief, she had made food. The women from the church had brought food. The kitchen table was not visible under the casseroles. I was in the hallway about an hour into the reception, holding a plate I was not eating from, talking to Mrs. Odoms, who had come because she had known my grandfather through me, and that is the kind of woman she is. We were standing near the study, the small room off the hallway that my grandfather used as an office, where he kept his files and his desk and the reading chair he fell asleep in on Sunday. Afternoons. The study door was not quite closed. I heard my Aunt Vera's voice first. Vera was talking to someone. From the voice, my cousin Denise, Vera's daughter, who is 24 and has her mother's instincts about money, if not her mother's polish. Vera said he already had it set up with the bank years ago. It's a separate account, not part of the estate at all. Denise said, "What kind of account?" Vera said, "Some kind of education fund. A trust." For Laurel. A pause. Vera again. "He told your grandmother about it 2 months before he died. She just told me this morning. Apparently, he's been putting money in it for years." Since she was in high school, Denise said, "What does that mean for the estate?" Vera said, "Nothing. It's completely separate. The estate is the estate. This is its own thing. It goes directly to Laurel with no involvement from the rest of us," Denise said. "Does Laurel know?" A longer pause. "Vera, I don't think so. And I need to think about whether there's anything to be done before she finds out." I stood very still in the hallway. Mrs. Odoms had registered that I'd gone quiet and was watching me with the attention of a woman who had worked with young people long enough to read stillness. I did not move for perhaps 15 seconds. Then I said to Mrs. Odoms quietly, "I need to use the restroom. I'll be right back." I went to the restroom. I ran cold water over my wrists. I looked at myself in the mirror. Then I thought in order about the following things. My grandfather had been putting money into an education trust for me since I was in high school. He had set it up through a bank, separate from his estate, which meant it did not go through the family will and could not be redirected by whoever was administering the estate. My grandmother knew. My aunt had just found out. My aunt had said in those words that she needed to think about whether there was anything to be done before I found out. There was nothing to be done. I already knew, she just didn't know I knew. And in the time it took me to dry my hands and walk back down the hallway, I had already decided that I would not tell her. Not yet. Not until I understood exactly what I was holding and whether there was anything she could actually do and what she might try if she thought she had time. I'm a case manager. My entire professional life is documentation and timing. You do not act on information before you understand its full shape. You wait, you verify, you build the file, and then you act in the moment most likely to result in the outcome your client actually needs. I was my own client now. I walked back into the reception. I found my grandmother and I hugged her and told her the food was wonderful, and I meant it. She held my face in her hands for a moment, the way she did when she wanted to say something she wasn't ready to say, and then she just patted my cheek twice and moved toward the kitchen. I found Vera in the living room and hugged her too. She hugged me back with the warmth of a woman who did not know I had been in the hallway. I drove home that evening and I did not call anyone. I sat at my kitchen table and I wrote down everything I had heard word for word, while it was still precise in my memory, because that is what I do. I document. After the funeral, I contacted the bank. It took 2 weeks and a copy of my identification and a letter from my grandfather's attorney, a man named Howard Park, who had been his lawyer for 15 years, and who was, I would come to learn, the only person outside my grandmother who had known the full shape of what my grandfather had built. Howard Park was in his 70s, soft-spoken, the kind of lawyer who became a lawyer because he believed in what law was supposed to do and had spent a career trying to make it do that. He met with me on a Tuesday. He sat across from me in his small office and opened a folder and told me what my grandfather had done. Gerald Voss had established an education trust in my name when I was 16 years old. He had funded it consistently for 11 years. From his pension, from his savings, from the money he had not spent on things he could have spent it on. The trust had a specific purpose: post-secondary education, graduate education, and professional development expenses for Laurel Ann Voss. It was administered by the bank. It was irrevocable. The funds were mine to access upon verification of qualifying expenses, with any remainder passing to me outright at age 30. The total, as of the date of our meeting, was just under $94,000. I sat with that number for a long moment. $94,000 that my grandfather had built, quietly, over 11 years, one contribution at a time, from the pension of a man who drove a city bus. Howard Park said he was very specific about the trust structure. He did not want it to be part of his estate because he was concerned that the estate distribution process might create pressure or complications for you. He wanted the money to be yours independently of anything else that happened in the family. I said he was protecting it from interference. Howard said that was his word. Yes, he used it in our initial meeting. He said he wanted it protected. I said, did he say from what? Howard was quiet for a moment. Then he said he'd watched how his family handled money for a long time. And he said he'd also watched you, and he knew what you would do with it. And he wanted to make sure nobody stood between the two. For 8 months after my grandfather's funeral, I watched my family from a careful distance. This is not unusual for me. My professional life requires watching systems carefully and noting what they reveal about themselves over time. Families are systems, and like all systems, they show you their logic if you watch long enough. What I watched, my father called me about the estate distribution. My grandfather had left his estate, modest but real, divided among his 2 children equally. This was straightforward and nobody contested it. What my father mentioned carefully in the same conversation was that Vera had asked whether there was any way to redirect some of what Gerald had set aside for my education to Marcus, given that Marcus was also pursuing higher education, and surely Grandpa would have wanted to help both grandchildren. My father said this carefully. He said it the way he said things he didn't entirely agree with, but felt compelled to relay. I said, "Dad, what did you say?" He said, I didn't think that was how trusts worked. I said, "It isn't." He said, "I know." He paused. He said, "Vera is going to bring it up." I said, "I know." He said, "You don't seem worried." I said, "I'm not." Another pause. Then my father said, in the voice he uses when he is trying to be a better man than he usually manages, "He loved you, Laurel. Whatever else, he loved you." I said, "I know, Dad." I did know. The $94,000 was the most legible sentence he ever wrote me, but it was not the only one. The second thing I watched, Vera started talking about Marcus more. Not unusually, Vera always talked about Marcus, but the register shifted. She started working his law school acceptance into conversations with the specific frequency of someone building a case. Isn't it wonderful about Marcus? Marcus has worked so hard for this. You know, law school is so expensive. We're all going to need to come together as a family. Come together as a family. I knew that phrase. I had heard its relatives my entire life. My family uses togetherness the way some families use credit cards, as a mechanism for distributing costs to whoever can least afford to say no. The third thing I watched, my grandmother called me in February, 4 months after the funeral. She called on a Sunday, which was not unusual, but her voice had something in it that was different from her regular Sunday voice. She said, "Laurel, I want you to know that your grandfather made sure you were taken care of. I want you to know I was part of that decision. We talked about it together." I said, "I know, Grandma." A pause. She said, "You know," I said, "I heard Vera talking to Denise at the reception." In the study. A very long pause. Then my grandmother made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh. She said, Well, he always said you were the one who paid attention. I said, he was right. She said, Vera has called me 4 times about it. I want you to know I told her the same thing every time. That it was Gerald's money, Gerald's decision, and that it was done and legal and finished. I want you to know I'm not going to be moved on this. The dinner invitation came in September. My mother called warm and unhurried. The way she called when the purpose hadn't been named yet. She said, "We're doing a dinner for Marcus. He got his acceptance confirmed. The enrollment deposit is paid. He starts in January. Vera wants to celebrate, and you know how she is when she wants to celebrate. Carmine's private room, the whole family. You should come, sweetheart." I said, "Of course." She said, "It'll be so nice to have everyone together." There was that word again. I said, "Looking forward to it." I hung up and sat at my kitchen table. I opened the folder I had been building since October, 11 months of careful assembly. I went through each page, then I called Howard Park. I said, "Howard, I need you to answer one question for me." He said, "Of course." I said, "Is there anything Vera could do at this point to challenge the trust or redirect the funds?" He said, "No. The trust is irrevocable. It was properly executed. Your grandfather was of full legal capacity. The bank is the trustee. There is no mechanism by which another family member could redirect the funds." I said, "I already knew that. I just needed to hear you say it." He said, "Laurel, are you all right?" I said, "Yes. I'm about to be better." I made one more call that evening. I called Mrs. Patrice Odoms, who was now retired and living 20 minutes from Cedar Rapids, and who had shown up to my grandfather's funeral because she was that kind of woman. I asked her if she was free for dinner on a specific Saturday in September. She said, "You know, I'll come anywhere you need me." I said, "I need you at Carmine's Italian Kitchen, and I need you there early." She said, "Do you want to tell me why?" I said, "I need a witness. Someone who has known me long enough to know exactly what I am and what I have built, and who will be in the room when my family finds out they have underestimated both for a very long time." I want to pause here for a moment. I know what some of you are thinking. You are thinking, why go at all? Why walk into a room where you already know the ceiling is lower for you? Why sit at that table? I have asked myself that question. My therapist, Dr. Malone, has asked me that question in exactly those words, and she is skilled enough to ask it in a way that doesn't tell me what she thinks the answer should be. Here's the honest answer. I went because I had spent 27 years being underestimated by people who loved me, which is its own particular kind of loneliness. The kind where the wound doesn't come from cruelty, but from the steady accumulation of being looked past. And I had spent 11 months knowing something that would change the picture entirely. And I had been patient, and I had been documented, and I was ready. I did not go for revenge. I want to be precise about that. Revenge requires wanting them to suffer, and I did not want them to suffer. I wanted them to see. I wanted the room to see, and I wanted to see it happen, just once, because I had watched the other version for 27 years, and I was done watching it. There's also this. Grandpa Gerald built me something. He did it quietly and over a long time, and he did it because he believed in me before I had fully learned to believe in myself. And I thought he deserved to have that known, not by me in private, by the people who had looked past me in his own family. That felt like something I owed him. So I dressed, simply. I brought the folder. I drove to Carmine's, and I was ready. The private room at the back of Carmine's has a long table, a gold banner hook above the window, and a sound system nobody ever figures out how to use. The lighting is warm and low and the kind of flattering that makes everyone look slightly better than they feel. I had eaten in that room at 2 other family events and had sat in both cases slightly to the side in the seat that gets less of the light. This time I sat at the far end. I sat there on purpose. I wanted to be able to see the whole table. Mrs. Odoms had arrived 20 minutes early. She was seated in the main dining room at a 2-top near the pass. Close enough. She had a glass of white wine and a book she was not reading. When I walked past her on the way to the private room, she looked up and held my gaze for one moment. I nodded. She nodded back. The room was already warm when I entered. Vera at the center, animated in the coral blazer she wore when she wanted to be noticed. Marcus beside her, genuinely pleased with himself in the easy way of young men whose pleasure has never been complicated by the awareness of what it might be costing someone else. My parents at the side, my father with his careful look, my mother with her party voice warmth. Denise? Two of Vera's friends who had apparently been included because the more the better when you're celebrating something. A couple from the neighborhood my aunt had known for 20 years. 11 people in total, and the empty chair at the far end. My chair. I sat down. The banner above the window said, "Congratulations, Marcus." The champagne had already been poured. A toast had apparently already been made because the glasses were at the half-empty mark and the energy of a room that is already toasted and is now in the comfortable warm aftermath. My mother hugged me. My father squeezed my shoulder. Vera said, "Laurel, so glad you came." We were just saying. She did not finish the sentence. She often didn't. The incomplete sentence was one of her tools. It implied a prior conversation about you that you were not going to be told the content of, and the implying was the point. I smiled. I set the folder beside my plate. Vera's eyes went to it briefly, the way eyes go to things they are trying not to show interest in. The folder was plain manila. The tab face down. I left it that way. Marcus was gracious, actually. I want to give him that. He came around the table to hug me and said he was glad I made it, and I believed him. The dinner moved through bread and salads, and the particular conversation of a family that has rehearsed its togetherness enough that it knows where to put the pauses. I asked Marcus about the program. He talked about it with real enthusiasm. The first-year curriculum, the city, the apartment he was looking for. I listened. He was 22 and going to law school, and those are real things worth being glad about, regardless of everything else in the room. Vera was watching me. She had been watching me since I sat down. Not directly, the way you don't look directly at something you're trying to assess. I have done it myself with clients who I think might know more than they are letting on. I recognized the technique. I watched her watch me, and I ate my pasta and I waited. It was Denise who opened it, not Vera. I think Vera had planned to do it herself, but Denise had had 2 glasses of champagne, and Denise's patience had always been shorter than her mother's. Denise leaned across the table toward me, in the confiding posture of someone about to say something they have been coached to frame as concern. She said, "Laurel, can I ask you something?" "It's a little sensitive," I said. "Sure." She said, "We've all been thinking about Grandpa a lot lately. Obviously, and we were wondering whether you'd thought at all about the education fund he set up. Whether you might want to think about sharing some of it with the family, given that Marcus is going to have real expenses, and Grandpa would have wanted to support both of his grandchildren." She said this with a face arranged into an expression I can only describe as rehearsed compassion. The look of someone who has practiced saying a thing they know is wrong in a voice calibrated to make it sound generous. The table shifted. Not everyone had known this was coming. My father had gone very still. My mother was looking at her plate. Marcus, to his credit, looked uncomfortable. He said, "Denise, I didn't ask." Vera touched Marcus's arm. She said, "We're just raising it as a family conversation. Grandpa is gone, and we all love him, and we want to honor his spirit of supporting education in the family. Supporting education in the family." I had to admire the construction of it. She had taken my grandfather's actual stated purpose and used it to argue for the opposite of what he'd intended. I looked at Vera. I looked at Denise. I looked at my mother, who was still looking at her plate, which told me she had known this was coming and had chosen not to warn me, which was its own kind of information. I looked at my father, who met my eyes briefly and then looked away. And in that look, I saw the thing I always saw in my father, a man who knew the right thing and could not find it in himself to do. It in real time, only later in apology when it cost him less. I picked up my water glass. I took a slow sip. I set it down. I said, "Can I ask who put this on the agenda for tonight?" Vera said, "It's just a family conversation, Laurel. Nobody put it on an agenda." I said, "Right? But someone decided Marcus's law school dinner was the right moment to raise it. And I'm curious, who thought that was the right context?" A brief silence. Vera said, We're family. There's no wrong context for family conversations, I said. I heard you and Denise talking about it at Grandpa's reception. In the study, the room changed temperature. Not dramatically. Just a degree or two, the way a room changes when a window opens that nobody knew was there. Vera said, I don't know what you think you heard. I said, you said you needed to think about whether there was anything to be done before I found out. That was the phrase. Before I found out, the table was quiet in a new way. The two neighborhood friends were looking at their pasta. My mother had finally looked up from her plate. Marcus was staring at the tablecloth. I said, I found out. Vera's expression did something I had not seen it do before. It held. She is a disciplined woman, and she held the expression. But the discipline was visible now, which is different from being invisible. She said, We're not trying to take anything from you, Laurel. We're asking you to think about the family. I said, I've been thinking about the family for 27 years. I'd like to talk about what that has looked like. I opened the folder. I laid the 3 documents on the table, not the letter, the trust summary, Howard's letter, and my timeline. I turned them so the table could read them. I did not point. I did not narrate. I let the paper do what paper does. My mother read the trust summary first. I watched her eyes move across the page, and I watched the line of her mouth change. Vera reached for Howard's letter. She read the highlighted line. She read it again. I watched her read it again. My father was looking at the timeline. He read it slowly. When he got to the line about relaying Vera's request to me, he set the page down and looked at the tablecloth. Denise had pushed her chair back slightly, not standing, just creating small distance. The physical vocabulary of a person who is beginning to understand they have overplayed a hand. Marcus was very still. He said quietly, to no one in particular, I didn't know any of this. I believed him. Vera said, This is not what tonight was supposed to be. I said, I know. She said, We are a family. We're trying to have a family dinner. I said, We're having one. She said, Laurel, your grandfather would have wanted. I said, Aunt Vera, I have a letter from my grandfather. I know what he wanted. She stopped. I said, He wanted me to have something that was mine, that nobody could redirect or reroute or convince me to share away in the name of togetherness. He set it up through a bank specifically so that it would not be subject to family pressure. He made it irrevocable specifically so that by the time we were all sitting somewhere having this conversation, there would be nothing to argue about. I looked at her steadily. I said he knew this conversation would happen. He planned for it 11 years ago. He just made sure it would be very short. The room was quiet. The kind of quiet that has texture. Then Vera did what people like Vera do when a plan has not worked. She changed the register. Not an apology. Vera did not do apologies. A reframe? She said, We're not your enemies, Laurel. We're your family. We love you. I looked at her. I thought about the word naturally gifted, said at a Thanksgiving table when I was 17. I thought about 4 calls to my grandmother in the months after the funeral. I thought about an envelope sent through a bank to a 16-year-old girl who had not yet learned she was worth protecting. I said, I know you love me, Vera. I'm not saying you don't. She waited. I said, I am saying love isn't the same as fairness. And fairness isn't the same as equity. And equity is what my grandfather was trying to build for me. One deposit at a time, because he could see that the other things weren't getting there on their own. My father looked up from the tablecloth. He was looking at me. His eyes were wet. He said nothing, but he looked at me. I said, I'm not going to share the trust. It's irrevocable. So I couldn't if I wanted to, but I also don't want to. My grandfather built it for a specific purpose. I'm going to use it for that purpose and honor what he built. Vera said, and Marcus? I said, Marcus is going to law school. His family supports him, and that is wonderful, and I genuinely mean that. He has an aunt who has advocated loudly for him his entire life. That is worth more than most people realize. He is going to be fine. Marcus looked at me. He said, Laurel, I'm sorry this happened like this. 22 years old and the most gracious person at the table. I said, Marcus, none of this is yours to apologize for. He nodded. He picked up his champagne glass and drank, and the gesture had something final about it. There's one more moment I want to tell you about. After I had gathered the 3 documents back into the folder, after the conversation had come to its particular quiet end, I excused myself to use the restroom. And when I came back through the main dining room, I stopped at Mrs. Odom's table. She looked up from her book. She looked at my face, and she read it the way she had always been able to read me. She said, "Well," I said, "it went how it needed to go." She said, "Are you all right?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "I will be." She said, "Your grandfather would be proud." I said, "I think he'd say I was just getting started." She smiled. She said, "He'd be right." I went back to the private room. I sat down, I ate the rest of my pasta, which had gone cold, and I did not say anything else about the trust, and neither did anyone else. The evening ended the way awkward family dinners end, gradually. Coats found, goodbyes exchanged, the particular thin warmth of people who have been through something together and are not sure what to do with it yet. My mother hugged me at the door. A real hug, longer than her usual, and I let it be real. My father walked me to my car. He stood in the parking lot with his hands in his pockets, not quite looking at me. And then he said he was right to do it the way he did. I said yes. He said, "I should have stood up for you more over the years." I said yes. He said, "I am sorry." I looked at my father, 58 years old, a high school football coach, a man who had loved me consistently and advocated for me inconsistently, and who had on at least 3 occasions I could name, chosen the easier thing when the harder thing would have cost him. I said, "I know, Dad." He said, "That's not enough, is it?" I said, "It's a start." He nodded. He hugged me quick and tight, the hug of a man not accustomed to expressing what he actually felt, but trying. Then he went back inside. I sat in my car for a while. The September air came through the window. I could hear the distant sound of the restaurant, the murmur of other people's evenings. I thought about my grandfather in his reading chair in the study, filling out a deposit form for the 11 years of Tuesdays he had built for me. I thought about him choosing the bank over the will because he knew the difference between what a family says and what it does. I thought about Howard Park handing me the trust summary and the letter on pale blue stationery and saying he would know when. The timing had been right. I had known when. I started the car and I drove home. 3 months have passed since that dinner. Vera and I have not spoken directly. I did not expect to. Vera is a woman who processes loss through distance. And what she lost that night was a narrative she had been constructing for 11 months. And the distance she needs from me right now is the distance of a person who is not ready to rewrite it yet. I'm giving her the time, not because I owe it to her, because I have learned in my professional life that people need to arrive at new understandings on their own schedule. And pushing them before they are ready only produces resistance, not change. My father has called me twice since the dinner, both times just to talk. The second call, last week, he asked about my caseload and listened to the answer. Actually listened, asked follow-up questions, knew the name of the supervisor I had mentioned the week before, paying attention. I noticed. I told him so. Marcus sent me a text. He said, "I hope things are okay." And I meant what I said at dinner. I really didn't know, I wrote back. "I know. Good luck in January. You've got this." He sent back a single "Thank you, Laurel." My grandmother called the following Sunday. She said, "I heard it went all right." I said, "It went how it needed to." She said, "He always said you'd know what to do when the time came." I said, "He was right." She said, "He usually was." We talked for an hour about her garden, which she was putting to bed for winter, about his reading chair, which she had not moved, about the way certain people leave a shape in a room even after they're gone, a warmth in a specific spot, an indent in a specific cushion, a silence that sounds different from other silences because it belongs to someone. I said, "Grandma, thank you for telling me about the trust that morning, at the reception. I know you didn't have to." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said he asked me to. Before he died, he said, "When the time comes, make sure she knows. Make sure she has time to learn what it means before anyone else gets to it first." I spend my days working with families who are navigating systems that were not designed with them in mind. Systems that require documentation and persistence, and the specific kind of patience that comes from understanding the rules well enough to use them on your own behalf. I teach people that the paper matters, that the timing matters, that knowing what you're entitled to before someone else tells you what you're not is the difference between a door that opens and a door that stays closed. My grandfather taught me all of that before I had words for it. He taught me with a story about the Henderson family and what the bank got to decide. He taught me by standing up in the third row of my graduation. He taught me with 11 years of deposits and 2 pages on pale blue stationery and an irrevocable trust that used a very specific word: protected. He protected me, and then he taught me, by example, how to protect myself. I'm 27 years old. I have $94,000 in an education trust my grandfather built for me. I have a career I built for myself, a caseload of families I show up for every day, a folder I know how to assemble, and the specific calm of a person who has learned that the most powerful thing in any room is not the loudest voice. It is the person who did the work before they walked in. That is my story, a funeral reception and an overheard sentence. 11 months of patience and documentation, a folder with 3 pages and a letter I kept for myself, a family dinner where the paper said what I did not need to. If you have ever been the one in your family who was looked past, underestimated, given the one candle while someone else got the party, I want you to hear this. Sometimes the people who love you most are not the ones in the room. Sometimes they are the ones who built something for you before they left and trusted you to find it, and trusted you to know what to do when you did. You do not have to prove your worth to people who have already decided the number. You just have to know the number yourself and carry it somewhere they cannot reach. Drop a comment. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. Tell me if someone in your life built something for you quietly, or if you're still waiting to find it, or if you're in the middle of your own folder right now. Share this with someone who is sitting at the wrong table and hasn't yet found the one that was always saving them a seat. Subscribe if you have not. Still waters run deep. I will see you in the next one.